In this video, we'll discuss Neanderthals. We'll be talking about the physical comparison of Neanderthals to Homo sapiens, along with the specific evidence of Neanderthal lifestyle and culture. We'll be talking about archaeological sites spanning from the first archaeological site in Neander Valley in Germany in 1856 to one of the more modern ones, which would be in the Denisovan Cave in Russia, where Denisovans coexisted with Neanderthals. Very interesting archaeological sites. The first one would be less of an archaeological site, more just of a finding, but it's still very interesting and very important to understanding Neanderthal history. So let's move on. What is the main purpose of the video? The main purpose of the video is to describe the process of how to create Neanderthal tools, along with the purpose of these Neanderthal tools. Why did Neanderthals make the tools they made? What was their purpose? What were these tools used for? It is very interesting. I'll be showing videos of also how to create these flakes that the Neanderthals were making. It's a very interesting and hard process to go around, and I'm really excited to be presenting this to you. So let's start off with talking about when Neanderthals actually existed. So they existed around 300,000 years ago to 28,000 years ago, and it's hesitant to say due to the fact that there's only physical evidence of Neanderthals existing 40,000 years ago. But why do I say 28,000? Because there was evidence of Neanderthals existing and persevering in the Rock of Gibraltar. It is a very interesting site, but the problem is there is no physical evidence. The specific location of where they were persisting would be in Gorham's Cave and in Vanguard Cave. These would be more inland. They're on the coast now, but they would be more inland due to the fact that during this time of Neanderthals' existence, there was a glacial period, which is very important for our next topic, which would be the physical characterization of Neanderthals. But these Neanderthals, this isn't the last place they existed, the Rock of Gibraltar. If in truth it was, this theory is correct, as it is a theory, then there would be most likely pockets of Neanderthals in multiple areas in Europe and possibly in areas of Asia that they existed. But it would be individual small groups that would be just last efforts, and it would just be slow decline until the last one didn't exist anymore. But let's move on to the physical characterization of Neanderthals in comparison to Homo sapiens. So currently on the screen you see the actual comparison of Neanderthals to Homo sapiens, and you see the labels. These labels being a wider rib cage and larger nasal cavities. I want to focus on those two first. What those two could possibly be used for, why they were evolved to have those things, would be so that they could generate heat into the air that they breathe in. What I mean by that is basically that with these larger nasal cavities and larger lungs, they could breathe in and filter air quicker, filter it to be warmer. This would help with a cold environment in which they did exist. But this is only a theory. There is also other theories for why they might have had larger nasal cavities, but this is definitely one of the more prevalent theories that exist, that these physical characterizations that they have that are different to Homo sapiens were for the purpose of surviving in colder environments. The other physical characterizations being thick-walled limb bones, shorter lower legs, and shorter torso. It means that they are lower to the ground. They are possibly more well-balanced due to the fact that they are shorter, and a little bit more wider. It gives them more of a sense of balance. Why is this important? It's for the next physical comparison that is different to Homo sapiens, and I personally believe the largest difference, and it is muscle composition. Not bone composition, but muscle composition. And where? Where it is, it's in the shoulders, right here. They have a large amount of muscle right in the shoulder, and what this doesn't allow them to do is put their arm back. Now, you must be thinking, what could this possibly mean? Like, well, how could this affect them so much? What this does is that they can't throw. If they have a spear, they can't throw the spear since they can't put their arm back like we can, like Homo sapiens. They would only be able to go here. Throwing like this is not going to get you far. You're gonna maybe throw like maybe a couple meters. You have to get back to throw far. So what this changed the hunting style of Neanderthals. Neanderthals had to thrust. They could start like this, and they could thrust into their prey with spears as well. This is important because this could limit their creation of new tools, like the possibility of a bow and arrow. They would never be able to use one, hence they can't put their arm back. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would create the bow and arrow, but it means that they would never think about it as their physical ability never allowed them to do those things. It is important when thinking about tool creation and the process, as they are not going to create tools that are not useful. These people are trying to survive. They are going to be not wasting materials on they could be using it on new ideas, but they're not going to be overabundantly using the materials they have. It's not as, they are not limited in the materials they have, but in survival, you're going to be focused on what works. And what works is that they had the same method for 200,000 years of flint knapping. Either it worked phenomenally and they never wanted to change it, or they just couldn't change it because there's nothing else they could have created. Or possibly people say they weren't smart enough. That's what they thought of decades or two ago on Neanderthals, that they weren't the most intellectual beings. And we'll be talking about that as well. But there's many theories of possibly why. But it is the facts that for 200,000 years, this process did not change. It was the same. So after talking about the physical composition of Neanderthals in comparison to Homo sapiens, let's talk about the next topic, being where they existed. As this is also important because you are going to be creating tools that are useful in the region you are. If you have large prey, you're going to be making larger flakes. Small prey, small flakes. You need certain material in certain regions. You have certain materials in certain regions. You don't in others. They're very important for survival of Neanderthals. So it is important to know where they are. So on this map that you see presently in front of you, you see that they span all the way from the UK to even regions of modern-day Russia. The Russian area would be where the Denisovans existed and coexisted with the Neanderthals. And we'll be talking about a site next about the Denisovans. We also will be talking about the one, like I mentioned earlier, from the Neander Valley and other sites in Spain. But now, since we understand the region in which these Neanderthals existed, let's now speak about this particular site in Russia, in the Denisov Cave. It is a very, very interesting site. It's especially this one that I will be talking about, this study. These three paleogeneticists discovered a bone fragment. It's around 3 centimeters long. And what's so important about this bone fragment is that it belonged to a 13-year-old girl that was half Denisovan and half Neanderthal. This proved that Neanderthals and Denisovans coexisted, and this was around 90,000 years ago. The migration of Neanderthals was much earlier to the regions of Denisovans than was thought before. And it is fantastic. This was found in 2012, as I stated earlier, in the Denisova Cave by Russian archaeologists. The paleogeneticists were Vivian Slon, Savante Babo, and Max Planek. These people do deserve credit for their findings, as it is very intriguing. They ended up finding it due to protein composition inside the bone. And this site, proving the migration and the coexistence of these Neanderthals with the Denisovans, helps us get a better understanding of the culture and the lifestyle that these Neanderthals had. It is very important to understand what type of environment you are living in, to understand what type of tools you would need to be creating. And having these social environments of coexisting with other species is an environment that is necessary to understand. But moving on, I also want to talk about the concept of how Neanderthals were perceived, as I did mention this earlier. Neanderthals were not seen as intellectual beings, probably up to a decade ago. Probably decade or two, they were seen as not the brightest. Not only that, they were seen as barbaric. They were seen as many things, not smart. Not smart, they were brutal, they were brutes, they were primitive. They were basically this like ape-like figure. Thanks to recent archaeology and scholars, we now discover that it's not true. They were in fact intelligent beings and, like we said, really close to us, Homo sapiens. So there is proof of this as well, that people did teach this, that they were primitive and all that. And here's an article from 1985, and from February of 1985, from a German article. And this article, I got translated, and it is very intriguing. It tells us perfectly of what people were thinking of Neanderthals during the time. So this is not that long ago when you think about it. It is 36 years ago. So majority of scholars that have finished their PhDs probably were alive at the time at least. But what did this article say? This article was perfectly translated, and it says in the second paragraph, a statue showing the essence is to represent with which this essay will grapple. Mute and with wild eyes, ape-like face, stood a figure, clad only in linen cloth. This Neanderthal man looks into a world which is no longer his own. Grimly, he can take a long, strong club, wood in his hand. The viewer will have a chill run down their spine. These people are talking about like they are some primitive animal. Not like we coexisted with them. Majority of people in Europe at least have some Neanderthal in them. That's me included. We coexisted with these species, and they were very intelligent with us. At the time of this article, it probably was not that well known of a fact, and we have to give them the benefit of the doubt as possibly they didn't want to think of them as intelligent beings. But now, thanks to archaeology, we do know that they are more like us than what we thought they were 36 years ago. And it is important also understanding this, knowing the history of what we were teaching that Neanderthals actually were. But this article was actually writing about an interesting. It was talking about a celebration of the 125th anniversary of archaeological site, and they were commemorating it with a statue of that Neanderthal, which we see currently on the screen, and you can sort of tell that it looks sort of primitive, looks like ape-like, looks like a monkey in some certain way. And it doesn't really look like a Neanderthal as I showed earlier. And here are some more images of what people thought Neanderthals looked like. You sort of see the ape-like idea, the hairy, the barbaric. It is images that you wouldn't consider, I don't know, how would you say it, agreeable today, to today's standards. But this article is commemorating an archaeological site, or a finding 125 years ago in Neanderthal Valley, which we'll be talking about next. It was discovered by Johann Fullerot. Not really discovered, but he did really help with understanding what this actually was, what this finding was. He was basically there in the region, and let me just speak about how this was found, and then I think you'll understand. The first human fossil assemblage described as Neanderthal was discovered in 1856 in the Feldorf cave in the Neanderthal Valley. It's near Dusseldorf in Germany. The first skull was found in 1848, but it actually wasn't credited as Neanderthal until later, after Johann Fullerot actually found the second finding in 1856, as they didn't know it was a different species at the time. It was found in a quarry in Gibraltar. It was discovered 8 years later by an amateur, which was Johann Fullerot. He was a naturalist. He was not. It wasn't really an archaeologist. He was the most well equipped in the region to sort of handle a new type of species. He was a teacher, I believe, in a local school, and they ended up calling him to the site, and he's the one who recognized that this is an important finding. He identified a similar skull and additional remains in Neander Valley, and in 1864, it was named a new species of human, Homo neanderthalensis. I'm definitely butchering it, but I do apologize. But you see how it is written on the screen currently, and it is very important. He was the one who identified the importance that this was a Neanderthal, in fact, a Neanderthal. And this wasn't just another Homo sapien, or primitive Homo sapien. This was a different species. So we do have to credit him as well with understanding it. He was not the one who found it. It was probably found by miners. But it is important that he was a big part of the project. He was the man that ended up changing the face of the Neanderthal species. These are the images of the two findings. So the half of the skull will be found in the quarry, which was found many years earlier in 48, while the assemblage of the body that we see in comparison with it is the one from 56. I apologize. The skull is from 56. It's the headpiece, along with the rest of the remains, which would be found. It is a very interesting site, and I mean, it makes sense why the first Neanderthal finding we have would be a body. Reason being is because we can see the difference in physical characterization. We see the difference in the skull, we see the difference in the bones, in the legs. Otherwise, if we find artifacts, it would be really hard for them to understand that this is a different species that made this, that this is a different type of technology, at least at the time, if you don't know there is a physically different type of being that was there. So that is also important to understand the history of Neanderthals. But I wanted to move on to talking about something that is going to be more related to the idea of tools. But it also will tell us more about the lifestyle of Neanderthals. It's a very interesting site. It's the site of Apapurca. It's very fascinating. So Atapurca is found in north central Spain. It's called Cima de los Huevos, which is the pit of bones. The reason why this site is so incredible is because there was the discoverance of 28 bodies. Fascinating. The only issue with this is that this was 430,000 years old. Now, we don't know if this is Neanderthal or if this is the species that evolved being into a Neanderthal. Whichever way this goes, the technology and the creation of bones comes from this species, so it still helps our case. And the site and the archaeological evidence in the site is fascinating and has to be spoken of. So when I was in Spain, when I was taught about this site, we also learned one cool aspect. And why was it such an important site? Because this is the image in front of you of where this site was found. If you can't read the graph or the graphs, basically it's a hole that these bodies were tossed into. They're tossed into this crevice, into this natural cavity, and they all settle at the bottom of the cavity. Possibly it could have been thought that why possibly some Neanderthals or some species ended up dying, and possibly some rainwater, some floods pushed them all into the cavity, and they ended up dying in there, or they were dead already. This would be possible. But why wasn't it? Because there was no evidence of anything else besides the bodies and artifacts that came with it later, which I'll mention. Why is this a shock, and why does this change the theory? Because if there was in fact a flood or rainwater, then there would be other dead specimen with it. Possibly dead animals from the region, rats, even anything. But there wasn't. There was simply nothing. It was simply just the bodies and artifacts. And one of the most fascinating artifacts, one of the most fascinating one, that Julian Handx. Here's an image. Fascinating artifact. This When archaeologists talk about artifacts not being as important as theories, it is true. But in this case, this artifact, it's on a pedestal. It's fascinating. Even the size of it, and the perfect preservation of it, and the colors, everything makes it so beautiful. It was a hand axe, and it was left, meaning one thing. This tool perfectly preserved and was still able to be used. So there was a reason they left this tool. Like I said, they make things to survive. If they left this tool, it means it was important to leave this tool. What could have happened is this was a ritual burial that they ended up burying their loved ones and the dead members of their group. And this hand axe was left in there. It's fascinating. And it does give a very big sense of importance to tools, which is the main focus of the video. Tools not only are used for survival, but could have a ritual purpose to them. So a toolmaker in the group could possibly be buried with one of these, or a warrior could be buried with one of these due to their importance to the group. So not only are tools created for their importance in survival and their use, but also possibly for ritual purposes. And that is important to understand, that the tools aren't only used for what they are thought of to be used, but they could be used for different purposes, and that is very important to understand. Here's a video of how this looks like in 3D. It's a fascinating artifact. So this site is from the lower Paleolithic. I want to talk about also the size of the groups that the Neanderthals were in. 10 to 30. 10 to 30 people in the group. And they didn't stay in one place. They always rotated. They always moved from site to site. The food was important. They traveled with the food, and that's why they made the tools depending on the food. And they moved region to region with their tools, or leaving tools in certain sites to come back to them the next year or next months. And this is one site I want to mention, and this site is in my heart as I worked on this site. It's the site of Roca del Bos. It's a site from the Middle Paleolithic period, and it's in the beginning of the Pyrenees. And I can talk about this site in much depth, and I will be showing some beautiful archaeological evidence of this site. But the one intriguing thing is the food they hunted. The food, because this does go into food, is very important with the tools that we find. They hunt wild ass, wild horse, and deer. These three are the main primary source of food in this area of Roca del Bos in Catalonia, Spain. And this is important to understand. Why? Because we see throughout the archaeological evidence that these are the main primary sources of food. But when I arrived on the site, we went to the stratigraphy level of N18. And in this level, we start seeing something really cool and fascinating happen. Around the region of 55 to 53,000 years ago, there was a huge amount of turtle bones that we find. Turtle bones. Fascinating. We do not find it in earlier periods, closer to us. We don't find it 40,000 years ago in the stratigraphy levels. We find it there, and we don't find it after. And we find it only in this one region of the site so far. And it's fascinating to think because, and it is also important to understand that when Neanderthals don't have the need to hunt as much, as a turtle, you don't really hunt much. You just go to the nearest shore, pick it up, and cook it. Then there's less need for tools. And we find that during these different periods in the site, there was more lithics in one time when there was less bones, and there was more turtle bones in one period and less lithics. This is only theories though, as well, as this was not their main primary source of food. Those three that I mentioned earlier were still their primary source of food, but it is a cool concept and theory to think of that since they had a more abundant amount and easier to access food, possibly the necessity to make lithics is not as important. But this site is intriguing when it comes to lithics due to the fact that it has natural quartzite, beautiful, beautiful quartzite with a bluish tint at the site, but it doesn't have any flint. But we find flint. We find flint at the site. We find many flints and beautiful ones, as you see on the screen. Beautiful artifacts. And where do they get it from? The nearest flint deposit for the Neanderthals would be 10 miles north or 10 miles south of the site. They carried the flint cores with them to Roca del Bos, as we know it's true, as we do find debitage at the site. We find BP2G and BP1G of flint, and it's something that gives us the understanding that this was important for them. Bringing this flint there and working on the site is important for these Neanderthals. And that is something that we have to take in consideration when creating these tools, because they go out of their way to get this material. So they clearly loved it. They clearly needed it. And flint is also one of the coolest ones to make. They take the flint and they put it into a fire prior to flinting it, and it makes it easier to get nice, beautiful pieces from it. Quartzite is not as easy. Quartzite, you have to go at it, and if it works, it happens, it happens. With practice and experience, obviously, Neanderthals are better. But with the flint, it was easier, it was nicer, it was smoother. So different materials, different tools. You're more likely to use the rough edges of a quartzite compared to a smooth edge of a flint for different purposes. That is very intriguing. In the next section of the video, I'll finally be talking about the creation of tools. How do you create these tools? Very interesting. This next section of the video, I'll be talking about the creation and the purpose of Neanderthal tools. So we'll start with a video of the process of how to flint knap. In this process, you clearly see me trying to flint knap the stone. And it is important to understand what angles these Neanderthals were thinking of. When they flint knap, when you don't hold, you have to make sure you hit like this. You're not moving this stays. This is the part that moves while you hold the core in place, as you see in the video. Obviously, it was not the most experience I had, so obviously my hand moves after the contact, but you're meant to keep it in place. It's very fascinating. They're saying that the best hit would be on a 45 to 60 degree angle. And thanks to this, we know that when this process of hitting occurs, you see many small flakes flying off. This is amazing for archaeologists. When we find a huge deposit of small flakes, small fragments, which we call BP2G, which as a small piece has been modified, we know that in that area either was the disposal, the waste, or that was the area they actually did flint knap. That was the area they worked in. And usually these areas were around the hearths, which were the key life of Neanderthals. That's where all the social life happened, where the work happened, everything. Everything revolved around the hearths, which we find, which is a fireplace. But in this process, we see the flint knapping happen. We have to also understand in this process, if you are trying to create a certain tool, you hit at different angles, you get different core pieces. If you want a bigger piece, you hit closer in. It's all a different process that you would have to create different tools. Let me give you an example. If you wanted to possibly create a side scraper, for instance, what is a side scraper? A side scraper is used for hides. It's not too sharp. It's not too sharp of a tool. Here's an image of a side scraper. A side scraper is used basically to clean hides. After, let's say, they hunt deer and you want to clean the hide, you would use a side scraper for that purpose. There's also denticulates with sharp edges. Those are harder to find. Those are used for cutting. It's basically the equivalent of a knife. It's used on wood as well, and it's also used to make bone incisions, because bones were used as tools as well. Neanderthals used a lot of things as tools. Bones could be used as hammers. They could be used to grind. They could be used to attack. They could be a weapon as well. They could be used many things. We see Neanderthals get creative with their tools later on, especially in the Upper Paleolithic, which I'll be talking about one of the tools from that period as well. One important piece, one important tool as well, would be a notch. What is a notch? A notch basically is also the shape of a side scraper, but instead of it being not sharp, it's a half circle. And what it is used for is to sharpen sticks, or sharpen wood. That's the main purpose of it. It makes spears. You can make a spear to attack that doesn't have a point at the end, and it'd just be a sharp stick that you could use for many things, possibly to stick meat on, or to multi-purpose basically. But since we're talking about multi-purpose, there is also something called a compound tool, which is a multi-purpose tool. You can have a side scraper with, let's say, a notch or denticulate, all three. You can have all three together. It's very interesting. In reality, compound tools are also very hard to go around. From my personal experience, you find more compound tools with a notch and something else, usually a side scraper and a notch, as you don't really want to, or possibly a denticulate and a notch. You don't really want to have a side scraper and a denticulate, as if you're holding one side, the other side can pierce you. So if you're using a denticulate, no real problem. You're not going to get cut by the side scraper. But if you're trying to use a side scraper and the other side's a denticulate, your hand's going to get mauled by the teeth. So it's not really that practical. So that is also something to take in consideration when we're mixing all of them together. And the one thing I have mentioned earlier, a point. What's a point? A point is a knife as well. It's a weapon. It's basically a sharp point that is used on ends of spears or used to cut. It has many purposes, but it is a weapon. It is a weapon. Depending on if it's only used on spears if it's longer. It has to be longer. If it's smaller, it's used on smaller prey. So the longer the flake, the more likely it was used on a spear. But it is also very interesting. The Neanderthals use hammerstones that also are very difficult to find. You have to have a right hammerstone. If the hammerstone doesn't fit and if it's not useful, then we won't be finding any good tools. Like if the hammerstones are not useful or if they break too easily, you're not going to be using it. It's a very important part of the process as well. And hammerstones are also multi-purpose, just like many tools I talked about. The hammerstones themselves also, not only are they used for possibly retouching the tool, which would be making it into tools. So you use a hammer, you use a hammerstone, you hit the core, the flake comes off, you get a flake. The flake isn't instantly a tool. You have to retouch it. You take the nice flake you just got, you retouch it to get the sort of type of points that you want. Either you make it sharp with teeth with a small hammerstone, or you make it a side scraper, which means basically you don't give it teeth, you just cut off an edge so it's a little bit sharper, but not too sharp, and that would make it for hide. That's the purpose of smaller, larger hammerstones. But it also has another purpose. Hammerstones are also known to be used for grinding. They were used for grinding herbs. That's why whenever we do discover hammerstones, you're not meant to wash them, as they were used. We could use technology to discover what type of herbs they were eating. We could find out their diets from the discovery of hammerstones. It's very fascinating. And they're also very interesting to find. Here's an image from Roca del Bos of a hammerstone that was discovered. These things can be large, like this one in the image, and they can be smaller as well. We found multiple ones in the site this year in 2021 in the Roca del Bos, and they are fascinating things to find. They are the rarest to find on archaeological sites, and it makes complete sense. You go through more cores with one hammerstone than you go through hammerstones from cores. You have the lowest chance of finding hammerstones. In stratigraphical levels at Roca del Bos at level 10, I apologize, you had a 0.6 chance of discovering a hammerstone. 0.6 of the artifacts were hammerstones. Obviously, the majority of percentage would be microdebutage, which would be small fragments small lithics from the small parts that come off when you have contact. Like I'll slow down the video. Small flakes come off the core. These aren't useful. These are trash. They're trash. We're going through their trash. And these cores, these small little pieces, can now be used to understand. We, archaeologists, can now use this to understand where they were doing it. But for the Neanderthals, are useless. And for us, if you're recreating this process, you're useless. You're throwing it away. You need a perfect flake. Even if you get a nice shaped flake and it's not sharp enough, or it's just not the right shape, you're not going to use it. You're going to get another one. You're gonna keep going. Same with everything. Has to be perfect. Everything has to work, or you're going to be going at it for a long time. If the core is in the right shape and you hit your finger, you start bleeding. That's happened. I've seen it happen. It's a process. The last tool I do want to mention, as it is an interesting tool, would be the burin. The burin was not something you could find at the site of Rocanambos, the one I'm talking about, because it was from the Upper Paleolithic. It was from the end of the Neanderthals' existence, and it was very interesting. It was used for engraving on wooden bones, and what this could do is you could engrave into the side of a piece of wood, and you could use sap. I believe they did use sap to hold in sharp stones. So you could take a bunch of points and engrave into a piece of wood and put it onto this tool. And I have a spear with multiple points on them to be more deadly. So now when they thrust into these deer or wild ass or any type of food that is around them, they can do more damage. Even if they thrust and it runs away, it's going to die due to the amount of puncture wounds it now has, due to the amount of points it has. And it's more likely to go deeper because you're cutting through more flesh. So it's also important to understand that they did develop their tools, sadly, at the end of their existence. And this could be because of the coexistence and the swapping of technology with Homo sapiens. But we see this only at the end of their existence, in the Upper Paleolithic. It is a very interesting topic. Thank you guys for watching the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I want to give credit to all the archaeologists out there that were a part of discovering this data that we were looking at today and giving us availability to look at this really interesting data about Neanderthals. And I also wanted to give a big thank you to my team that I worked with at Roca de Bos. If you guys are seeing this, hi, and hope you guys enjoy, and hope to see you guys again soon. Thank you.